Hey everybody, this is the part 2 video of assignment 2 that's going to cover setting up specific display modes in Rhino so that you can get a specific output that we can bring into Photoshop eventually. So what you see in front of me is the model that I've been using as my example model, just some little construction that I came up with, so it's a mass planes and frames, etc. Very tectonic, that sort of thing. I have, as you should, 5 layers, a frame layer, a mass layer, plane layer, a people layer, and a circulation layer. Each one of these I've given a color, and I've paid a bit of attention to it so that the colors will look fairly nice together, with the exception of maybe the red that kind of stands out. I could maybe adjust that and make that something like, I don't know. I'll spend more time on that some other time. The point is, think about your color scheme somewhat as you pick these, because these are the colors that you're actually going to see in your final composition. If you're familiar with it, Adobe has a website called Adobe Colour, which I think is Kouklor or something. Google that. It basically is a color picker that helps you pick mathematically correct color schemes. It's a great thing to do if you want to see what other people come up with for color schemes, or if you're just out of ideas, or if you want to know mathematically precisely what is a accurate color scheme, because these things can actually be measured, although tastes are subjective still, of course. Anyways, the point of this is really to set up a view that you can export. So the first and most important thing is we need to set up a specific view. This assignment is aiming to make an axon. So I'm going to click in the upper left-hand corner here where the blue perspective label is. If you have 4 windows, all you have to do is double-click on one of them. And I'm going to go back to perspective, and that will bring that particular view up. So right-clicking here, I'm going to go down to Set View, and then I'm going to go down to where it says Isometric. And for me, I know I'm going to use Northeast. You may want to try these. These are the cardinal directions, of course, or the off-axis cardinal directions, and they are what you'll want to use to align your isometric view. And you can see here, click it, immediately it aligns to this. Now, you may have to select the objects if you have a bunch more things in your model and type in ZS so that you zoom to them. And you can, of course, zoom in still, pan around, pick the view that you think makes most sense, whatever it may be. I'm just going to use zoom selected so everything is centered in my screen. And then go down to display options. Go to view and down to named views. You can also type in named views, but I'm just going to go down here. And I already have one view named, but I'm going to save another. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a little thumbnail, but also as I'm working and modeling and I've done a bunch of things and now I can't remember what the view was I liked, all I have to do is double click this and it'll instantly take me back to that view that I already set up. This is incredibly important when setting up renderings because oftentimes you will export a bunch of images, bring them into Photoshop, start rendering, and realize, I just wish I moved one piece. Well, if you've moved your camera in Rhino, you cannot go back to what it was unless it was saved. Meaning all that Photoshop work is useless because any new things you export wouldn't align to it. So it's good to set this up ahead of time. It's easy enough to do, and name it something that you'll actually remember. Later on, you'll probably have Rhino models that have a whole bunch of different named views for different interior perspectives, axons, plans, whole bunch of different stuff. So it's good to start naming these things early. It's in general a good idea to always be naming in basically every software, whether it's Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, Rhino, of course, Revit, whatever it may be. Naming organization is key to all of these softwares. And it's something I will probably mention in every tutorial that we do from here to the end of the semester, because that sort of organization will keep you sane later on. You may be tight for time right now in studio trying to get things done, but later, at some point, you may be trying to take this little composition you made and bring it into your portfolio. Maybe this semester, maybe a later semester. But if you have everything named and organized on layers, it's going to be much easier for you to come back and manage that file again than to try to figure out what you did 6 months ago when you can't remember anymore, why things were on certain layers and other things were on different layers. The same thing really applies for professional work. When you are working in an office, it is absolutely essential to keep good layer management and naming things. There are times you're going to hand off your work to someone else. And if all they see is that your file name is called final, that's meaningless to most people. It's meaningless to you 6 months later anyways. So good naming, always a good idea. Rant over. Anyways, so if we right click up to the left-hand corner here, there's going to be a few default views. So you have your wireframe, your rendered, your ghosted, X-ray, technical, artistic, pen, Arctic, and ray traced. We're really going to be concerned with a couple of these right now. I'm going to go to rendered first. So I typically work in shaded view and or ghosted view. Ghosted is really useful because you can see through things and it's really helpful for modeling sometimes. Rendered view, you might have clicked on accidentally before and realized that your computer freaked out, but we're going to use it this time. So in order to get the render view to do what we want, and we're going to export a series of different images, I'm going to go down here to display options. So again, I just right click this upper left-hand corner, went down to where it says display options. Again, with this command and practically any other, you can also type it in at any point and it will come up. The beauty of command line that exists in Rhino and other software is any command you can think of, if you can type the name, it will come. So display options, and actually I'm going to restore defaults for this one and all of my others because I'm going to show you what it looks like from the beginning. So this is what the render view will look like for you. There's a few things that are different than what I was showing. I did not change terribly much from my render view. The first I did change though was, you see how there's this line in the background? That's kind of an artifact of looking at this thing in Axon. If we were in perspective, let me make this go away for a second. Or shift back over to a perspective view, you can see that goes away. And essentially what it is, it's some kind of artifact of viewing in Axon where we view this plane that goes off into infinity, but it's shading a little bit weird. So to avoid the issue entirely, we're just going to turn shading off of the ground plane. So again, I went back to where it said, just to follow that one more time, right click here, display options, and it will come up with whatever display you currently have running, which I have the rendered. I'm going to go to the ground plane settings and set to custom. And this toggle here that says on, I'm just going to turn that off. Essentially, it's no longer going to cast artificial shadows onto a ground plane that doesn't exist. So now we only have shadows on our object. So that's all we're going to do for that one. We'll come back to that in a second. Next we're going to go to is pen. Pen looks kind of great almost immediately, except for the fact it's on a weird background. For some reason, they put pen on a fake paper background, which is terrible, and you should never export it like this. We're going to fix it the same way by going to display options. And in this case, under the pen option, the background is set to have an image file. We're going to get rid of that, just set it to solid color, and it's going to be white. Another thing, we're going to scroll down. There's a few options under pen. One is show silhouettes. I'm going to have that turned on. And essentially what that is show line weights. It essentially does an approximation of what it thinks line weight should be in your model. And in general, for this view, they're pretty good. So for the most part, they're usually worth keeping on, but just know that's where they are in case they are worth turning off for some reason. There's some other things you may want to mess with. Show seams. Sometimes this can be a good way to get rid of some excess lines if you end up with too many. Same thing for edges. You can kind of fiddle with this and figure out which ones make sense for you to keep. There's also hidden lines, which are lines that you see beyond, but we're not going to use this. And I'm just going to hit OK. Now this is all set up as we're going to need it. Not very much we have to do. The final one is Arctic. This looks like the render mode, but is actually slightly different. It's what's called an ambient occlusion render. which basically is a fancy word that means we're getting shadows on objects that aren't based on a particular light source. They are based on their proximity to another surface. So if we have two surfaces that are next to one another, so this little pad and this little piece of paper, normally a piece of paper, like here, is receiving light from 180 degrees like this. As soon as we put on the piece of paper here, it can only receive light from 90 degrees. Whereas the further you move away, the more light you can receive from that full 180 degrees again. So anytime you have a corner, you inherently get a shadow just based on the fact that ambient light isn't coming from all directions anymore. It's only coming from a limited number of directions. So you get a shadow in the creases that happen in models and in real life. So this particular mode called Arctic, don't know why it's called Arctic, but it is, simulates just that, just the shadows that happen in creases. But it does tend to make a very clear looking model because it essentially highlights all the separation of surfaces. Anyways, like all the others, we're going to be editing this. So I'm going to go down to display mode. And same thing we did for rendered, I want to adjust the background. So I'm going to turn that off because I don't want that weird shadow off in the background distance. And again, if you're in perspective for another assignment, there may be reasons why you keep that on. The next thing is, I don't want all of my model to be white in this particular view. So I'm going to go and where it says color and material, I'm going to set, let's see here, objects color. And basically it's going to inherit all the layer colors that I'd set up before. And that's why it's really important to make colors that you are happy with for composition reasons. So I have now set up 3 different types of views: an Arctic view with color, a pen view with line weights, and a rendered view with shadows. So if you do not like the shadows, or you find they look different than this for some reason, type in the command sun, which is as simple as it sounds. What it will bring up are the controls for the simulated sun in your scene. And the panel should look something like this. It also will probably have environments, lights, and ground plane. If you don't, you can type in any of those words and those panels will come up. The sun by default is, I don't know what the default is really actually, but if you set it to on, turn off manual control, or you can turn it on, you can see that you just basically are given full control of the sun to bring the shadows from any direction, including the shadows coming from a sun in the north, which makes no sense whatsoever, but you could do it. Again, probably don't ever do that because the sun should never come from that direction, as long as you're building your model appropriately to the direction of the sun. So we're going to turn that off. And instead we're going to use the date and time, in which case we can set any time of the year and any day or any time of the day during, on, and any time of the year. I said that all confusingly. So basically we could say July and 4 o'clock. And that's what the shadows would look like, assuming you've set up your model appropriately on the XY axes. Scrolling down, of course, we'd want to be in the correct location. Now, you can type in cities here. Cincinnati is not in here. However, Frankfort, Kentucky, I believe, is the closest thing. You can also press the here button, and if you've allowed your Rhino, it will figure out what the closest thing to you is. That distance between Frankfurt and Cincinnati is so small that you would never be able to notice the difference in the shadows, so that will work fine. And that's all you need to do. So find the time where the shadows are most appealing to you, maybe most compositionally pleasing, or showing the most that you feel is useful. The other thing is I'm going to go to the lights panel, which can be accessed by typing in lights or just clicking on the panel here. And there's 2 different lights that should be on by default in your model, a skylight and the sun. If we turn the skylight off, essentially we get these really harsh shadows because the only light source is a direct light source, so anything that isn't getting direct light from the sun gets no light whatsoever. If we turn everything off, we'll get flat shadows that aren't based on anything. They're actually based on the camera, which is really weird. If we turn the opposite on, we essentially get the ambient occlusion that we saw before. It's just ambient light in the scene. So I'm going to turn both on, and now we get some fairly realistic looking shadows. Nothing amazing, nothing hyper realistic or rendered, but all we need. I'm gonna go back down to display options, and then under display options here, where I have rendered mode, I'm gonna go down to the shadows tab. So this is where we can adjust the quality of these shadows. So we could just turn everything up to the right and we'll get the cleanest looking shadows possible. And that's probably a good idea when exporting an image. We could make them softer or harder. So if you look at the edges of the shadows, you'll see the difference here. And this is more of a preference than it is necessarily a one's better than the other. Although softer shadows are usually slower shadows as well. Edge blurring, which will blur your shadows, which to me just kind of looks, it gives me kind of a headache to look at because it looks like I'm just out of focus. The dirtiness, which is basically the sort of extra noise you see in the image. So again, for exporting, we're just going to turn that all the way up. You wouldn't want to model like this because it's just going to get slower and slower the more complex your models go. We don't have any transparent objects, so this isn't going to do anything. And camera-based bubble, ignore this. I have never once seen a reason to turn this on or really understood why it's here, but it is here. So we're just going to leave that. The other thing, you could change the shadow color if you want to do something weird like make all of your shadows bright red. So that's an option. That could be a stylistic thing you could do, blue shadows. But there's no real technical need. Anytime you're really doing this, black shadows are generally what you're going to be using. So once that's ready, now we need to export these three different display modes that we've created. So that's the pen display mode, the render display mode, and the Arctic display mode. The command I'm going to use is view capture to file, and just hit enter. Now, what we want is, it's going to capture the viewport. We want to have the grid, world axes, CP plane or C plane turned off, and transparent background. That's all fine. We could turn this on if we wanted to. It doesn't really matter right now. The resolution is going to be based on viewport. And then by default, this is probably going to be set to 1. So these numbers are going to be dependent on your screen and how big your Rhino window is in your screen. For mine, it's 2050 by 1175. I know that I want that first number to be higher than 3400 because that will give me a nice resolution for 11 by 17. So I'm just going to hit 2. You could do 1.5 if you wanted, but that may not be enough. So 2 it is. That'll give me an output resolution of 4100 by 2350, which should be high enough for 11 by 17. When thinking about it, 11 by 17, multiply any dimension by 200 to get 200 dpi, or 300 to get 300 dpi. For computer work and digital work, 200 dpi is generally fine enough. If it's going to be printed, you want to be 300 dpi. Whenever making renderings, and this process, it's not really going to make a huge time difference. There is going to be a difference in the size of your files, but the time is really not going to be very different. When you're doing renderings with rendering software, the difference can be astronomical. And that's where you want to be very careful that you're not rendering at too high a resolution, that it will take forever or never finish, which I've had happen. Or the opposite of it be too low resolution where it's not high enough and doesn't look very good for your intended use. So again, I'm just going to set this to 2, which just multiplies my screen resolution by 2, 4100 by 2350 for me. Hit OK. It's going to ask me to save. I'm going to save as one of these file types, specifically TIFF. As I mentioned on the first day, between TIFF, JPEG, and PNG, TIFFs are going to be your highest quality file type that do not compress the file. So you don't lose any image quality when you do this. And just hit save, name it as something. I already have all 3 of these named. To do the next one, I would simply go to pen and do the same, view capture to file, go to Arctic, view capture to file, and save all of these off. Next, I will open them in Photoshop. but that will be the next tutorial. So with that, I'm going to end this one here, and I'll see you in the next one.